Hello and greetings, my fellow ghouls, goblins, and ghosts. I want to welcome you all back to the Festival of Samhain Horror podcast hosted by Purga-Tori. That's me. And if you're a fan of the show in the past and listen to us on Spotify, we are temporarily moving to YouTube. So, welcome to the show. If you're new, I talk about horror, all things horror, big or small. And today I'm going to be starting the first week of 61 Days of Halloween. And I will be posting an episode each week. And this week I will be covering all things vampires. But not just vampire films. I will be covering all things vampire lore and vampire history. Some things I may accidentally leave out. There's just so much information about vampires out there. So if you like this episode and you want to see me cover vampires a little deeper and do more of a deeper dive, be sure to let me know in the comments and I can do that. Okay, so if you are a fan of horror movies, you more than likely are a fan of vampire films, just like I am. And I did so much research, and I've got a notebook full of notes on vampires, and I'll try to list my sources in the comment section, but let's get started. So, what is a vampire? I mean, we all know the answer to that, but truly, we all know a vampire is a creature that survives off of human blood, and they're immortal. These creatures, especially in European folklore, are undead humanoid creatures. Vampirism has been recorded in cultures all around the world for a very, very long time. The term vampire, or vampyre, V-A-M-P-Y-R-E, itself was made known in Western Europe when reports came in of a 15th century mass hysteria, which in a lot of cases resulted in corpses being staked and people even being accused of vampirism. In European folklore, however, vampires are described as undead humanoid creatures, like I mentioned before, but we all know that, especially if you're a horror fan or a vampire expert. And they were said to visit loved ones, or they would cause havoc and death in the communities they lived in when they were alive. The vampires of European folklore were described to look much different than the gaunt, pale vampire of today that predates the early 19th century. They were described as wearing shrouds and were described as bloated and of ruddy or dark countenance. But we all, know the basic vampire is, gaunt, Nosferatu, Count Orlok, or beautiful like Lestat or Louis, what have you. There are, however, variants of the term vampire or vampirism in Southeastern Europe, such as Striga, that's S-H-T-R-I-G-A in Albania, Vrykolakis in Greece, which is V-R-Y-K-O-L-A-K-A-S, and Strigoi in Romania, which is cognate to the Italian word strega, and Strigoi is spelled S-T-R-G-O-I, and the word strega, the Italian word, S-T-R-G-A, it means witch, which I thought was interesting and weird because vampires and witches are different, but of course in modern times, vampires are described as fictitious. There are many different characteristics of vampires too, as we know, as there are vampire legends. We already know that the main characteristic of vampires, which is they like to drain their victims of blood by sinking their sharp teeth into their flesh. And once they do this, they drain them of every drop of blood. They are also known to turn them into vampires as well. Some of their victims, their chosen victims, they will turn into vampires. Of course, across media, that is said to be done in different ways. It could be infection by a singular bite, but more often than not, the vampire must first drain their victim, then give their victim some of their blood. Then the transformation is complete. Of course, we also know that Vampyre, hunt exclusively at night since sunlight either weakens them or burns them to a crisp. We also know in some stories that they may or may not transform into bats or wolves, much like Count Dracula. They possess super strength and the power to glamour or seduce their victims. And of course, in some lore, they can't see themselves in the mirror or cast a shadow. It is said that Bram Stoker, author of Dracula, named the king of all vampires after Vlad Dracula, also known as Vlad the Impaler. I know a lot of you guys may know a lot about Vlad the Impaler, or you may not, but allow me to shed some light on who that is. He was obviously a very real and brutally cruel ruler who fought off the Ottoman Empire and, of course, earned his name because of his favorite way to kill his enemies, which was to impale them on a wooden stake. It's even said that Vlad enjoyed dining amongst his dying victims. And there are other resources that say, and of course, nobody really knows how true this is or not, but it's believed that he even dipped his bread into his victim's blood. Kind of sounds like something a vampire would do. And of course, whether those legends are true or not, in my personal opinion, they probably are, but we don't really know. Many people do believe that those are the very tales that inspired Bram Stoker's novel about Count Dracula, who to us is known as like one of the master vampires. There were so many superstitions though surrounding vampires, and these superstitions thrived throughout the Middle Ages, especially during the plagues, because the disease left bleeding lesions on the people who suffered with it. And to people who, for lack of a better word, were kind of ignorant to the plague and the disease and how it reacted in the body, they believed it to be linked to vampirism. In fact, it was actually quite common for people with unfamiliar illnesses, whether they be mental or physical, to be accused of vampirism. For instance, there is a blood disorder called porphyria. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. Porphyria, Porphyria. It's apparently a blood disorder that causes severe blisters on the skin when the infected is exposed to sunlight, much like vampires. This too could be one of the many things linked to the vampire legend, but who knows? In fact, some symptoms of porphyria can apparently be relieved, or said to be relieved, by ingesting blood. Of course, diseases that also promoted vampire mythology were said to be rabies and goiter. Not really sure why goiter, Goiter, was linked to vampires back then, seeing as it's simply just a condition where your thyroid glands grow larger. But when a suspected vampire died back then, however, precautionary steps were taken. In some cases, a stake was shoved through the heart of a corpse to make sure the deceased stayed dead. That, or they decapitate and or burn the corpse. But like Dracula, there are many other vampire legends. And one in particular came from America, Rhode Island to be exact. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this person, but there is a vampire legend about a real person named Mercy Brown. and yes, she was a real person, and she lived in Rhode Island. Her father, George Brown, he was a farmer, and unfortunately, he lost most of his family, including Mercy, to tuberculosis. It was not uncommon to exhume corpses back then for vampirism. So when they exhumed Mercy's corpse, they discovered that she wasn't severely decaying like the rest of her family. But the reason for this, however, is because her body was placed in an above ground vault during the winter. But because of ignorance, the townspeople actually accused her of being a vampire. They actually thought that Mercy was making her family sick from the grave. And because of this, they cut her heart out and burned it to ashes. When you'd think this ritual stopped there, it didn't. They proceeded to feed these very ashes to her sick brother. And tragically, but not surprisingly, he did die shortly after that. Nevertheless, there are people in the world who do classify themselves as real vampires. You know, just ordinary, everyday people who apparently drink small amounts of blood. This could be from willing donors, or some even say they just feed on the energy of others instead of blood. I know you probably heard of the term energy vampire, but that's what I'm assuming that's what that is, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm always open to discussion about these things. These people, they don't bother anyone, and they mostly keep a private life. There are even tons of communities online full of people who identify themselves as vampires, which I found very interesting. Like, I had no idea that there, were people that self-identified as vampires, and it leads me kind of want to go down a rabbit hole and research that a little more. Very interesting, pretty cool, but that'll probably be for another episode. To conclude this episode, I will end by saying I love vampires. I love the lore, I love the history, the literature, the movies. Ever since I was a little kid, I've always been fascinated by vampires. I even wanted to be one. I mean, who wouldn't? You get to live forever and you get to be beautiful forever. I mean, who wouldn't want that? The thing I love about vampires is that you can do so much with them. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit before I sign off. You can do so much with vampires, and that's what makes them so creative. If you're writing your own vampire story, you can make up your own lore and characteristics. When it comes to vampires, there really are no rules. Vampires can be ravenous, mindless, bloodthirsty creatures like in From Dusk Till Dawn, Stakeland, The Strain, or 30 Days of Night. They could both be bloodthirsty, romantic, and beautiful like in the Anne Rice Vampire series or True Blood. Or they could be demonic like in Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Fright Night. Or, I know this is probably a hot take, but even damn near indestructible and hard to kill like in Twilight. I know everyone's not that big of a fan of Twilight, but my mom and I, when she was alive, we loved watching the Twilight films together, and both her and I, we kind of discussed that these vampires are actually kind of scary because they're harder to kill. Their bodies are a lot harder. They're a lot more like stone, and they're harder to kill. You basically have to, if you have the strength to rip their head off, you can't even stake them, and you have to burn them, so they're very hard to kill. But anyway, you could do so much with them. There are no rules, and to me, that's what makes vampires so expansive and fascinating and creative. And honestly, vampire films are one of my favorite, like vampires are my favorite subgenre of horror, just because it's so expansive and you can do so much. I would definitely have to say my top 10 favorite vampire films would have to be Interview with the Vampire. I know a lot of people don't like Queen of the Damned, but I like Queen of the Damned. I haven't read the book, but I am actually going to get into the whole Anne Rice series eventually. Fright Night 1985, which just happens to be my favorite vampire film of all time. I love that movie. And The Lost Boys, Stakeland, John Carpenter's Vampires, even though I'm not that big of a fan of James Woods, it's still a great movie. And of course I like the guy that plays Valak in that. He plays in as Terry Silver in The Karate Kid 3 and Cobra Kai. I like Vamp from 1987, I forget when that came out, The Night Flyer, and God, there's just so many good vampire movies, so many good, and From Dusk Till Dawn, so many good vampire movies, and there are probably more that I like, but those are some of my favorites. And like I said, one of my favorite subgenres of horror, if not my ultimate favorite subgenre of horror, next to slashers. I want you guys to let me know in the comments if I missed any vampire lore. There's just so much information out there and so much that I couldn't get. But if I left out anything, feel free to let me know. Still kind of rusty at podcasting. I haven't done this in a while. It's been kind of a rough year, but I'm not going to get into that. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I'm going to be recording a podcast and uploading to YouTube each week. And it's going to be a solo podcast because my hubby is actually doing his own thing right now. So it's just going to be me, and I promise to get better. I'm a little rusty, kind of nervous, but that'll get better. Anyway, that concludes this week's episode of Festival of Samhain Horror Podcast. Be sure to like and subscribe, hit the little bell notification so you never miss when I post, and have a good day. Pleasant screams.